I want to begin today to do a series of videos on the pre-wrath rapture of the church. I got some notes here and some charts that I may use. I'm not sure, but the pre-wrath rapture is a rapidly growing belief system that teaches that that the New Testament church will go into Daniel's 70th week. Certainly will go into the first half, and somewhere in the last half, somewhere during the last half of the 7-year period of time known as Daniel's 70th week, some call the tribulation period, somewhere in that time the rapture will take place. And so it's a very popular, growingly popular position. Now, I am a pre-tribulationist, and I hold to that. Now, I have been thoroughly exposed to the pre-wrath rapture. I have here in front of me The Sign by Robert Van Kampen. I have, this one's getting a little tore up, the front cover has come off, but The Prewrath Rapture of the Church by Marvin Rosenthal. Now, the first book I ever read on the subject was this one, The Rapture Question Answered by Robert Van Kampen. Now, this is not the original copy I had. This is one that I bought years later. And so this is the first book I read on the issue. And I'm not going to lie to you, it bothered me the first time I read it. I thought, man, have I been wrong? And the preachers that have been teaching me, have they been wrong all these years about the timing of the rapture? And obviously I come from a pre-tribulational background. Now, I am of the persuasion that just because my pastor or someone else says it, I give them the benefit of the doubt, certainly, but at the same time, I want to study things for myself, and I was willing at the time, if this was right, then I was going to go with this, and regardless of what happened to me, because I want to be right. I want to make sure that my belief system is as correct as my fallen mind can get it. Now, and so therefore, I began to research the issue. I've been studying it for years and years and years. And then years later, I bought the book again, and this time after having studied the issue a little longer, I began to find what I felt like were contradictions. In some cases, contradictions, but not only that, but also unanswered questions. Now, see, that's I guess one of the attractive aspects of the pre-wrath rapture position. It seems to answer the questions. It has the appearance of answering the questions. For instance, the rapture takes place, according to them, in the last half of the 7-year period, but it's not exactly mid-trib, and it's not exactly post-trib. It's somewhere in there, and so no man knows the day nor the hour. So we don't know exactly when it would take place. And there's a lot of other teachings that come along with it that it really does seem in a lot of ways to answer the questions. But where I'm at right now, I don't believe it answers the questions. There's some questions and some verses that I feel like the pre-wrath rapture position is ignoring and not looking at and not considering. And so what I want to do is in these series of videos is ask some questions concerning the pre-wrath rapture. Now, I have a chart right here that I believe it was Robert Van Kampen's chart. This fellow, he's dead and gone. I believe he was a Christian. I believe he loved God's word. I'm sure he's in heaven. But this is basically his layout, and not every pre-wrath agrees with all the timing issues, nor does every pre-tribulationist or dispensationalist or amillennialist or postmillennialist, whatever you are. No two perfectly agree one with the other. For instance, right here you have the beginning of sorrows, right here. And in the beginning of sorrows, right here, Van Kampen has 3 seals, and during the Great Tribulation, he has 3 seals. But I've noticed a lot of Prewrathians who put 4 seals in the first half and only 2 in the Great Tribulation period. And they don't believe that the Great Tribulation goes all the way to the end. They believe it's just a small period of time in that second half of the Tribulation period. And so, but this is pretty decent layout. You see, you have the beginning of sorrows, the birth pangs, and then at the midpoint of the tribulation period, which would be the abomination of desolation, and I agree with them on that. But then they have a short period of time, we don't know how long, the Great Tribulation. Jesus said, beginning at the abomination of desolation, in those days shall be great tribulation. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give her light. And that sounds like the prophecy of Joel chapter 2, verse 31. Where Joel says, the sun shall be darkened, or should be turned into darkness, and the moon into blood before the great and the terrible day of the Lord come. And so here in this dark period, you have what they call the day of the Lord. And the rapture initiates the day of the Lord. In fact, that's his exact wording. The day of the Lord, the wrath of God, and he says initiates the day of the Lord. I don't know if you see it, doesn't matter, but that's what he teaches. That's what most Prewrathians teach, that the rapture initiates the day of the Lord. And I'm fine with that. I have no problem with that issue. And if you read 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5 together, ignoring the chapter division there, it seems like the rapture and the day of the Lord are connected. And so based upon that, they say, well, the day of the Lord is initiated by the rapture. However, Jesus says that the cosmic disturbances will take place after the tribulation of those days. Joel says that the day of the Lord takes place after the cosmic disturbances. And then, so if the day of the Lord happens after the cosmic disturbances, and the cosmic disturbances are after the tribulation of those days, and the rapture initiates the day of the Lord, then obviously the rapture must happen after the cosmic disturbances, which Jesus said is immediately after the tribulation of those days. And it also fits with the 6th seal, and he has that right here. At the 6th seal, you have the cosmic disturbances, which seem to agree with Jesus as well as Joel. And then, to add to their argument, the weight of their argument, where they put the rapture right here, you have in Revelation 7 this numberless multitude that came out of great tribulation. They believe that is the church that has been raptured, but after the 6th seal, but before the 7th seal, and that initiates the day of the Lord, which would include the trumpet judgments and the vial judgments here during what they call the wrath of God period. So that's a basic, simple layout. I can go in on a little more complexities than that to describe their belief. But essentially, they believe that right here you have the beginning of sorrows, abomination of desolation. You have the great tribulation, a short period of time. No man knows, the day nor the hour that the rapture will take place. That initiates the day of the Lord, and then you have the wrath of God. Now, that's the basic belief, that the day of the Lord happens here, and so therefore the rapture must happen here. Now, my question is concerning the day of the Lord. The timing of the day of the Lord seems to be one of the foundational, if not the foundational, doctrine or aspect of the pre-wrath rapture. So I believe, if they're correct, that the rapture initiates the day of the Lord. If you can find when the day of the Lord actually begins, then you'll have a good idea as to when the rapture takes place. So let's agree with them just for a moment, with the Prewrathians, that the rapture initiates the day of the Lord. I'm fine with that. All right, well, when does the day of the Lord begin? Well, they run straight to Joel chapter 2, verse 31, where the sun is darkened, moon is darkened. So you have the cosmic disturbances before the great and terrible day of the Lord. Jesus says those cosmic disturbances are after the tribulation of those days. And then you read down in Matthew 24, verse 29, where it says, after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be dark, and the moon shall not give her light. And then in verse 31, he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect with the four winds from the one end of heaven to the other. And that sounds like a rapture. And they believe that that is the rapture of the church. Now, so if they're right about the timing of the day of the Lord, then they're right about the rapture. I have an issue with their timing of the day of the Lord. You say, well, how can you have an issue when you got Joel 2:31? Well, I'll talk about Joel 2:31 here in just a moment, but I want to begin with looking at their breakdown of the tribulation period. Let's start with what's called the Great Tribulation. This part right here, the Great Tribulation. In fact, I have Robert Van Kampen's large book on it, The Sign, and listen to what he says on page 261, and if all the books are the same layout, then they should all be on 261. I don't know if other editions, changed how the layout is, and so that might change the page number, but it's under the chapter of the Great Tribulation by Antichrist. Here's what Robert Van Kampen says. He says, the term Great Tribulation comes from Jesus' Olivet Discourse. It's not the only place, but that is the most popular place, if you will, as to where that term comes from. The term Great Tribulation comes from Jesus' Olivet Discourse, given primarily to his disciples who were instructed to teach the church. He warns of a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever shall be. He says Christ, through the prophet Daniel, describes to Israel this same period of time in almost the same words. Daniel calls it a time of distress, such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. And that is the case. In Daniel 12:1, Daniel says that period of time is going to be the most horrific time this world has ever seen, agreeing with the words of Jesus. And then Van Kampen goes on to say, Jeremiah refers to this period of intense suffering as the time of Jacob's trouble. Alas, for that day is great, the prophet says. There is none like it. It is the time of Jacob's trouble. And so Van Kampen sees the issue as most Prewrathians do. Right here in the Great Tribulation, Jesus says it's a time like never before. Daniel 12:1, it's a time like never before. Jeremiah 30, verse 7, this is a time like never before. Obviously, those three men, Jesus, Jeremiah, Daniel, are all speaking of the same time. A time like never before. The Great Tribulation. And I completely agree with that assessment. It's going to be a time of trouble and tribulation like the world has never seen. And so Jesus, Daniel, and Jeremiah say that that is the case. However, I was wanting to check a particular verse one day out of this Prewrath Rapture book by Marvin Rosenthal, and I looked it up, and it was referenced to the Jeremiah 30 passage where it says, in agreement with Daniel and Jesus, that great tribulation is going to be a time like no other. And I noticed in the back of his references, he leaves out a very important verse, and that verse is Jeremiah 30, not verse 7, which is very important. Verse 7 agrees with Jesus and Daniel that time after the abomination of desolation will be a time of trouble like we've never seen. But in verse number 6 of Jeremiah 30, listen to what Jeremiah says. Ask ye now, and see whether a man doth travail with child. Wherefore do I see every man with his hands on his loins, as a woman in travail, and all faces are turned into paleness. And then he goes into verse 7, alas for that day, the day where he says he sees men as a woman in travail. He says that day is great, so that none is like it. It is even the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it. So Jeremiah likens that day, which the Prewrathians agree is the Great Tribulation, this time like no other. Jeremiah says that that's a day as travail upon a woman who's expecting a child, going into labor pains. Jeremiah says that day is like labor pains. Labor pains. So Jesus, Daniel, Jeremiah, it's the most horrific time of tribulation this world's ever seen. But also, Jeremiah adds the fact that it is like travail upon a woman. You say, well, what's the big deal about that? Well, if the Prewrathians are right, 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5 teach that the rapture initiates the day of the Lord. It is interesting what the Apostle Paul says about the day of the Lord. In 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 1, but of the times and the seasons, brethren, you have no need that I write unto you, for yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so cometh as a thief in the night. For when they shall say peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh upon them as travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. So, Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 5 that the day of the Lord is as travail upon a woman. Jeremiah says that the great tribulation, period, is a time as travail upon a woman with child. So Jeremiah and Paul have to be talking about the same thing. They're talking about a period of time as travail upon a woman. Well, if Jeremiah and Paul are talking about the same thing, which they are, it's a time of Jacob's trouble, it's a time as travail upon a woman with child. Well, Paul calls that day the day of the Lord. Jeremiah calls it that day. And so, if Jeremiah and Paul are in agreement, which they are, that the Great Tribulation is a time, is as travail upon a woman with child, if that is a time, which Jeremiah says it is, as travail upon a woman, and Paul says, as travail upon a woman, that the day of the Lord will be as travail upon a woman, that means the day of the Lord must include the Great Tribulation. So, we've proven at least a mid-trib rapture. Because if the rapture initiates the day of the Lord, and Paul and Jeremiah agree that this time is as travail upon a woman child, then the rapture can't happen here, it has to happen here. Which means the day of the Lord doesn't happen here, the day of the Lord would be here. And so you see the agreement of Jeremiah and Paul talking about the same time as travail upon a woman with child, but Jeremiah, Daniel, and Jesus say that that time is the Great Tribulation. And we're not done with that. I don't know if you can read it. It doesn't matter. I'm going to tell you what it says. Notice what he says right there. He says it's the beginning of birth pangs. He actually put the term there. The beginning of birth pangs. You say, what's so significant about that? Well, that's the beginning of sorrows, the beginning of birth pangs. The word sorrows means travail. In the Greek, the word is odin. In the English word, there in Matthew 24:8, it is sorrows in the King James Bible. But then you go to 1 Thessalonians 5, where Paul says travail upon a woman. In verse number 3, the word travail is the word odin. It's the same Greek word. It's talking about the same thing. Paul says that the day of the Lord comes as travail upon a woman. Birth pangs. Well, the first half of the tribulation period, we agree, is the beginning of the birth pangs. So if the day of the Lord comes as birth pangs, by the way, the day of the Lord is not the delivery itself. It is the labor time that we're looking at. The travail upon a woman that's a part. It's not leading up to the day of the Lord. It is the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord comes as travail upon a woman. That period of time is as travail upon a woman. So here you have travail upon a woman and travail upon a woman. Well, Paul says the day of the Lord is as travail upon a woman with child. So according to Paul and Jesus, the first half of the tribulation period would be the day of the Lord because it's birth pangs. And Paul said that's how the day of the Lord comes. According to Jeremiah, Paul, and Jesus, the Great Tribulation would be birth pangs because they said that it was. Jeremiah and Paul says this is a time like a woman with child. And Jeremiah and Jesus say that this is a time like no other. So that means Paul is saying, agreeing with Jesus, that this is the beginning of the birth pangs, which would be the first part of the day of the Lord. And Paul and Jeremiah call this a time as a woman with child. So therefore, all of this would be the day of the Lord, not starting here. I'll get to Jeremiah 2:31 in just a moment. But if the Prewrathians are right, that the rapture initiates the day of the Lord, and he says it does, and it initiates the day of the Lord, well, then you need to find the timing of the day of the Lord. Paul says it comes as a woman with child. Well, Jesus says it's as a woman with child right here. It's the beginning of those birth pangs. And so that means the day of the Lord would include the entire 7-year period. And if the rapture initiates the day of the Lord, then the rapture should be right here, not over here. Now, Jeremiah 2:31. Well, I think one of the things, the great errors of the pre-wrath belief system is this assumption that every time you see the day of the Lord, it must be speaking of the exact same thing. The problem with that is, well, first is what I just showed you. Yes, Joel says that the sixth seal, Matthew 24:29, all that is after the tribulation of those days, but it's before the great and terrible day of the Lord. I have no problem with this being the great and terrible day of the Lord. But it also means that you have to go sit back and re-examine your interpretation of the verses. It means that either there is multiple days of the Lord. There's the day of the Lord that encompasses the entire tribulation period. There's the great and terrible day of the Lord, which is the extreme wrath of God at the end. And I got another illustration concerning that as well. Either there are multiple days of the Lord, or there are different aspects of the one day of the Lord. I don't care how you want to say it. But obviously, Paul and Jesus and Jeremiah are putting the day of the Lord here. And the one that Paul is speaking of is where we find the rapture of the church. And so the rapture must initiate the day of the Lord, because the rapture will happen right here. It initiates the day of the Lord, which will be in agreement with Jesus and Jeremiah. All right? So that means that this day of the Lord is either another aspect of the one overall day of the Lord, or it's a completely different day of the Lord. And some people believe this, that they say this is just the general day of the Lord, and this is the great and terrible day of the Lord, where the great emphasis of the greater wrath of God takes place toward the end of the 7-year period of time. There's also Joel chapter 3. Joel chapter 3 says that the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. Well, that's the Battle of Armageddon. And Robert Van Kampen puts the Battle of Armageddon after the 7 years. I don't care. I personally believe it happens exactly at the end of the 7 years. But if it happens, a month after that, which he believes, I don't care. But Joel chapter 3 says that the Battle of Armageddon is the day of the Lord, and says it's near, almost ignoring this. In fact, Joel chapter 3 even says that there's going to be another darkening of the sun and of the moon before the Battle of Armageddon. Could that be a reference to the fourth trumpet, which is a darkening of the sun and the moon? Could that be Joel referring to that and not the sixth seal? So it looks like you got the overall day of the Lord, which Paul is clearly talking about because it's as a woman with child, in agreement with Jesus and Jeremiah. You have the great and terrible day of the Lord, spoken of by Joel, as well as Malachi in chapter 4, where Elijah is going to come before the great and terrible day of the Lord. And that seems to be the worst part of the wrath of God upon the planet. But then you have the day of the Lord in the valley of decision, which is the Battle of Armageddon. That's either three different aspects of the day of the Lord, or they're 3 different days of the Lord. And so context will determine which one it is. So a pre-wrathian needs to answer these questions. If you try to make the day of the Lord one thing in one period of time, then how are you going to deal with the fact that Jeremiah and Paul say that the day of the Lord is right here? Jeremiah and Jesus say that the day of the Lord is right here. You need to answer that question. So if the day of the Lord that Paul's talking about, which is initiated by the rapture, if it encompasses these 2 points of time during the 70th week, the birth pangs here and the birth pangs here, then it's a pre-trib rapture. It is not a pre-wrath rapture. It is a pre-trib rapture. And so I think that the burden is on the pre-wrathians to answer that question. How can you believe that the day of the Lord only begins right here? I understand Joel 2:31, but how can you believe it's only that, while you ignore the fact, and just as Marvin Rosenthal did, ignore Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 6. And I believe one of the reasons why I ignored it, because it was too obvious it is in agreement with Paul. And his comments on Matthew 24, verse 8, where Jesus speaks of the beginning of sorrows, he almost just brushes it aside, almost insinuating that, the fact that Paul and Jesus are talking in similar terms really doesn't mean anything. Well, it does mean something. It means a pre-tribulation rapture. It means the pre-wrath rapture theory is wrong. And that question needs to be answered.